Right, next up we have Josh Williams from Skills Consulting Group. Is that the title of the business today, Josh? Yep. And he's going to be talking about the supported induction, residential and group training for food and fibre.
Kia ore e te whānau, ngā mihi nui kia koutou, i te reo rangatira o tēnei whenua. Ko Josh Williams tōku ingoa, ko rua pehu te maunga o tāku ngākau, ko whanganui te awa o tāku ngākau, ngā mihi to the Cove, the board and CEO, and e te rangatira turi, ngā mihi mō tō kōrero. Kia ora, it's a pleasure to be here. I refused the Madonna mic, so welcome to my TED Talk. They also delivered to the table after morning tea my speaker's gift, which is a lovely bottle of Crab Hawke's Bay Sauvignon Blanc, so I'd better not suck because they've already given me the gift. We don't have long, but the really good part is I get to follow Michelle just now, who's talked about the Tupu Horticulture Group Employment Scheme, which is one of the inspirational pockets of innovation that I want to talk about. The model I'm about to talk about is I'm unreasonably excited about. So as a quasi-researcher, I want to acknowledge my bias as someone who gets unreasonably excited about vocational education and training models. But look, let's get going. If I click, is it going to turn into my slides? Okay, cool. Look at that, there it is. Those are Paul Holling's legs. I'm sure a lot of people in the room would appreciate that when you're mowing the lawn, sometimes you have your brightest ideas. Now, thanks to Paul, I'm not really buttering him up, but thanks to his range of professional experiences for a long time in the vocational education sector, he knows all about group employment, and he's now honoured enough to be running as GM of the Food and Fibre Centre of Vocational Excellence. So as far as that goes, this piece of positive disruption is about what if we took a piece of kind of food and fibre training that we all know about called residential training that's got a storied historical history. It certainly needs probably some updating and some modernising for the world of 2023. And what if we also thought about group employment, where we have the likes of Tupu or Tutuana, Fruition Horticulture, where we've got some really exciting group employment schemes going, but certainly not systematic. So I'd point to two things. One was Ian's term this morning, substantive collaboration for the benefit of the sector as a whole. And the other one is close your eyes and use your photographic memories to remember Vaughan's final slide, which was that at the end of the attraction and retention data, it kind of invites us to think about an initiative that involves employer exposure, a whole lot of pastoral care, and an induction process. Well, have I got a deal for you? Just so I'm not making any assumptions, I won't stick long on group employment because Michelle's just told us. But this is where an apprenticeship or traineeship intermediary is the actual employer of record of the apprentices, and they are hosted out into host employers. That is perceived and real, has a number of advantages, particularly in times like high employment. And in situations where you might have low unemployment but also high underutilisation. And then it's not a very long bow to think about industries like food and fibre, where there is a difference between what happens in March and what happens in September, and kind of accounting and being smart for that kind of seasonality. Residential training, I'm sure, as I say, there's a lot more familiarity around, the best known, long-standing, more than a century-old examples of the likes of Taratahi Agricultural. But of course, there's many more modern versions and training farms around the motu, and we've spoken to a lot of them. And it's a well-respected pathway into the industry. It creates networks that last a lifetime. We've had a lot of moving stories through the kind of first interview stage of this research. So I'm going to do the punchline now, then I'm going to talk about what we did, but I think it's always important to start with the why, isn't it? So group training is not very widespread in New Zealand. That's not just the food and fibre sector where it doesn't have a strong history. Really, we've only got kind of 4 biggie, single industry group employment schemes for the regulated trades, plumbing, electrical, gas fitting, drain laying and the like. That's well understood as a model there, where you have a group employing, a group entity that's employing, It's doing the HR, it's doing the health and safety, it's de-risking individual employers from their recruitment decisions in the case that things don't work out. Talent is scarce, the war for talent, right? Seasonality would suggest opportunities to improve utilisation because a job is better than a course. We've got lots of short courses and we've got lots of pre-employment stuff all across the vocational education and training sector. But what if you employed people from day one? And this is what we ended up calling, for want of an even catchier title, supported induction, where we would hybrid between a residential component and a group employment oversight of the learning as we go through. So we've got to modernise things for today's realities and de-risk the situation for individual employers. I'll also cut to the end there. A lot of people we've talked to about this that have not really heard of group employment much are kind of like, what's the catch? That's my question for you. I don't think there is one, so I'd love to hear it. But here's the thing. I want everybody to close their eyes and imagine that all around the motu, maybe 10 of them, maybe attached to jobs and skills hubs, maybe attached to 15 regional skills leadership groups, there was a group employment entity that was basically stood up as a talent management scheme that, according to the industry needs and demands for the food and fibre sector as a whole, was inducting cohorts as the need was and holding that pool of talent and allocating it around according to the needs and demands of the industry. It's a really interesting flip to think about it that way, but you just got to employ them first, and that's the proof of concept that we're into. So that's, I think that's the bit that I kind of like close my eyes and go, wow, wouldn't this be extraordinary if for the benefit of the whole food and fibre sector, these existed around different regions. Okay, what did we do? Well, we went to Nelson one day and we sat in a hub, which was a co-located place with a whole lot of different entities all involved with training for the food and fibre sector. And one of the people there said, what we really need is a hub. We need a co-located place where a whole lot of... So anyway, we've talked to a number of people and began with the first situational analysis back in July of 2022. Yeah, it was just that long ago. And that was really interview-based, and it was an international scan. Next week in Geneva, they will be discussing for the first time since 1962, literally, adopting a new quality standard for apprenticeships. So we looked at some of that stuff, what was going on. We then developed and distilled from the findings and the learnings and a lot of actually literally the killer facts and quotes that we got from those stakeholders as to, well, how would you boil this down into a potential model? So that was our second paper, August 2022. And from then to now, led by the Cove, has been trying to engage and successfully engage some enthusiasm about potentially trying out this in terms of some pilots, slightly different flavoured and different versions of pilots, but what I keep stressing is that actually pilots don't always prove scalability of things. This is really a proof of concept of a training model, and that what I would love to think actually is that somebody could pick up that second report right now, maybe a Te Pukenga, and just stand it up. So from then to now, yeah, that's what we're doing. We're putting the chess pieces together around resourcing, around potential partners. And again, I do really want to acknowledge that this is not a standing start, that what Michelle's just talked to us about with Tupu Horticulture, which, we were lucky enough to help to do some of the evaluation work on too. That's an extraordinary program. The completion rates, what they're achieving with those cohorts in terms of then direct transition seamlessly to full employment in the industry, given what, from my history, what we're looking at in terms of these cohorts of learners and their prior attainment in formal education, it's extraordinary. So, one has to be kind of enthusiastic about the potential of this. Key findings, I'm not going to read my slides because that's a really boring way to do a TED Talk, but, too long didn't read. The things that the stakeholders talk to us about with residential training is that total immersion, try before you buy, pants on before boots on, I think is a quote that always sticks with me. But really, is it for you? A fast fail opportunity, both for the employers and the learners. So before anybody's really made too deep an investment in this whole thing, can you actually, will this ever work out for you? And is this really what you want to be doing? So that's the notion of that first piece, we do an induction process, 3 weeks. But by the way, you're already employed, you have a job, and even part of the skills that you are learning is how to manage yourself as a new entrant worker into the industry. People are pretty wary about sending people a long way from home, both in terms of then their future employment and distance to travel, and also maybe some not so fond memories of schemes back in the 1950s where people might have left their rohe and never returned. And there's a Pākehā version of this too. Half the kids who go to university then rock up to the departures lounge at Auckland Airport, and only half of them come back too, right? So we're a bit worried about people leaving to get training and then actually not coming back. So there's this strong notion, and this particularly came through from iwi stakeholders, around making sure that actually that if the skills are by and for the hapu, for the whānau, that they come back to the hapu and to the whānau. And I think so that's very much inspired some of the things about the model and why I think that hub concept is the right way to think about it. There's not the disclaimer. The enthusiasm that we've had for the project has been very gratifying to me and my team, because there's been an awful lot of change in the vocational education sector, new players, new entities, new acronyms, and new resourcing systems, which we understand conceptually, but there is not a whole lot of practical implementation experience yet. So I guess that's challenge and opportunity. There's space for innovation. That was kind of what we got out of the situational analysis. The model, so as I say, I've kind of touched on a few of these things already, but just to kind of step through what it might look like. These things are not set in stone. It's got to be horses for courses, and it's got to be led by the needs of industries, but it's for the benefit really of the sector. So we're having a job, not a course. You're with a group employer, and actually you remain with the group employer. When you get through this program, that's not the end. You have the opportunity to be directly employed into further education, let's say, hopefully, perhaps a full apprenticeship. But if that's not the case, then you're all still employed by a group employment scheme with the ability to be hosted elsewhere. So there is that first filter kind of aptitude testing piece. We're placing for 12 weeks with 2 employers, so there's kind of 2 rotations of this, and that's about depth and breadth and finding your fit. I mean, it's the same industry perhaps, but every employer is different, every workplace is different. You know, we've seen many times over the years in programs like Got a Trade that actually a young person and an employer can hit it off in 5 minutes in a speed meet and actually completely change the career trajectory of that young person just based on those people relationships. And ultimately what we're kind of proposing in terms of content is at that kind of level 2 level, it's about self-management, it is about employability, core capabilities, work readiness, but we're doing that in context, we're doing that initially as a total immersion experience, which also carries those kinds of benefits. And ultimately that we want a head start, these are genuine, the stuff that's industry related is going to put you on the trajectory in the industry and help you with your next step. So yeah, it's not a course, it's a job, it's the start of a pathway, it's supported induction. So my final thoughts, as I've said, certainly when the Cove put out the second report and invited people to express some interest was expressed, possibly more than we can do for pilots. The resourcing pieces have also been mostly put together, particularly through the strategic component of the UFS and some enthusiasm from the Tertiary Education Commission, and I thank them for that. With Te Pūkenga as potentially the main support partner in terms of the training side, and there's a process around our recommendation that an existing group employment scheme with systems, processes and policies would be good to engage rather than starting from scratch. So really the only thing that's new is we haven't done this in the food and fibre sector before, and the question is, why not? It would seem to have a whole lot of natural advantages. It seems worth a go, I have to say. We get the impression from some of the meetings that we've been having, and maybe we're pitching it wrong. It's like you get a sense afterwards, this all sounds so good, what's the catch? As I say, I really don't know, except that substantive collaboration. This requires the employers, particularly those host ones, to make the commitment up front around the employment. But remember, they are not the employer, the group employer is. They've got someone to call. The apprentice has got someone to call. If it all comes unstuck, they can hand them back. So you go, this all sounds too good to be true. You know, what's the catch? There isn't one. Group employment, that's how it works. That's what it does. And it's actually completely underutilised in New Zealand, in my view. 7% of all of our apprentices in New Zealand are group employed. It's 20 in Australia, where they have state-based associations, national association. They don't just have single industry group employers, they have regionally focused group employers, they have multi-industry group employers. It is a model that is well worth exploring here in Aotearoa. I get unreasonably excited about vocational education. And I've said that, and I've said, I just do want to throw that one on the table because, you know, I note last week, as a newly minted proud Hawke's Bay resident, I'm very pleased, of course, to see new jobs and skills hubs announced for Hawke's Bay and now Tairāwhiti also. If I think back to those first hubs, Auckland Airport Alliance, we've got feeder schools, young people coming in, there's a whole swathe of employment opportunities. What if we stuck a group employment entity onto the side of that and we're actually employing them straight away into the group scheme, then rotating potentially around a number of industries? Bigger story. Final thing I want to say is, again, as a quasi-researcher, even this whole process of like coming up with a model and then thinking about how you might stand up a pilot, and is it a pilot, and you know how could it look in writ large, we're evaluating that whole process. You know, what's it been like meeting with MSD to talk about potential wage top-ups while they're in the residential? What about the cost to employers? What's even just the process of getting this thing going? We're all storing that in the back of our minds so that the evaluation component won't just be the 30 weeks of the program, it'll be everything it took to get there as well. Thank you very much.
Catherine.
Microphone coming.
Two hands. Thanks very much, Josh. You get unreasonably excited and I get more unreasonably excited off your unreasonable excitement. So MSD do top-ups because we saw that in the Infrastructure Skills Centre that we ran with the Construction Sectoral Court. Mm-hmm. My question, I guess, is not really what's the catch, but why the hell haven't we done this before in more than just engineering and some of the specialist trades, because you missed engineering as well, but why? What's the barriers?
When I've thought about this, I've kind of tried to compare ourselves with Australia, and there might be a market size component. I think, though, that with the regulated trades where it has kind of kicked off, it's been a little bit in-house in that regard because they are regulated trades. The group employment schemes have been started as kind of units of those industry associations, at least in the first instance. And those industries in particular, you know, because they are highly licensed and regulated trades, consistency means so much more to them. I mean, I reflect here on some of Ian's points around professionalising food and fibre and putting letters after people's names, or at least people's self-perception. I think the Cove is doing some really important thinking, both Coves I suspect, around quality of employers, particularly in terms of their contribution as learning and training organisations. But no, I don't know the answer, and in fact I've gone to Aussie and asked them, you know, and I think we do have an awful lot to learn. I will note that it's the Department of Agriculture in the state of Victoria has stood up 3 regional pilots for horticulture using a group employment model. That's occurring as we speak. We don't know the results yet, but at least it's interesting from a policy perspective that they're having the same thought at the same time. Why haven't we done this in food and fibre as much? So I think sometimes it is just sort of the distance to travel and the distribution, or perhaps the isolated nature of the industry, which means it hasn't happened in the past. But if I think about the situational analysis and what technology can offer now in terms of augmenting that learning and training, I think a lot of those barriers are no longer there. So, you know, let's start yesterday. Yeah.
Yep, over here.
I do really long answers to short questions. It's an area I'm working on.
Kia ora, Josh. Look, awesome. You know, really
Thanks,
good. And I think, you some of the reports that I remember Thomas Perinara did an awesome report out of the group employment scheme from ARA a few years back, and it showed really, really positive results.
Yeah.
Couple of observations points, I guess. Firstly, from an iwi-led perspective, you talk about that there, but I think, the kōrero that Michelle showed with us was it works because it was iwi-led.
That's
and
right.
because iwi were managing that through a whānau relationship, and that's key for Aotearoa. And then linking that back into what's happening in the Hawke's Bay at the moment around the recovery and the skills hub, that's very much going to be regionally hapu-led. So anything along these lines would have to have that component to it. Finally, progressive procurement is starting to become a really interesting conversation to have around the regions of the country. And I think Michelle mentioned procurement as well, but to be able to lift those organisations up and create leaders within those to pick up some of that procurement opportunity, these sorts of groups will become really, really important if they have like a really holistic nature to the skills that they get, so that these folks can be employed for 10 months of the year or 12 months of the year, but not necessarily always in one particular industry. And I think that's a really key element to think about as well. So, but really positive.
I'm sitting next to Arthur Graves, and he's been telling me for 15 years probably now about the value chain and, the supply chain and the pipelines. And this very much is, when we close our eyes with supported induction, we're seeing that 16, 17, 18-year-old as a new entrant to the industry. But, this kind of thinking, to your point, I think, ought to run across, it's lifelong, right? And we want to keep people in, and that's all about those pathways and progression. Investing in their skills is the number, apart from paying people, research report after research report, right? Authentically investing in the skills and upgrading your people, the capability development that you're talking about. Secondly, the iwi-led thing is very much a point taken, including we've had discussions with Te Hiku along exactly these lines. That's not why we're not setting in stone what the content is or what the credential should be or what the qualification is. But I think the discussion that needs to occur is, if we all invent this 1,000 times each, it might not be systematic. Is there some kind of ecosystem where, it must be iwi-led and it must come from the iwi, by iwi, for iwi, and I've seen those models work in large and small iwi already. So to me, I think that's absolutely where this needs to start, and borrowing from that model. So I think, as I said there, it must work for Māori, but it must also work for everybody.
Any other questions from the floor? Jacinta.
You mentioned the 16 to 18-year-olds. Was that the age of the people in these groups, or was this all ages?
No, so it's certainly not stipulating that it would be, but in my view, the way that when we had the stakeholder conversations, I guess the way I'd phrase this is, a lot of them quickly talked about the school to work transition. And in particular, attraction and retention, the sorts of things that Adam and team are thinking about in their project, where I think there's an important alignment. So, it is about getting people in, and I think that straight to work opportunity. A lot of the things that we do see, I think it was mentioned, primary ITOs, average person is 32, your average apprentice in New Zealand is 27. That actually speaks to an interesting issue around pathways. Not that those people did anything wrong, but actually why isn't there a clear and obvious pathway directly from school? I think supported induction could work for that age group, but I certainly am not saying that it wouldn't work for someone who's 25 or someone who's 32.
Does it work for mums? Because as a mum, I'd be going, how would I work?
Yeah. So the opportunity cost, depending on your life circumstances, of actually even being able to go and live somewhere for 3 weeks as part of a cohort for the induction, sure, no. But ultimately we can always straw person define the person that something could not work for. I think there are many that this could work for, and I think Tupu and many other examples, Growing Future Farmers, Smedley Coleridge, the residential schemes that we've seen, they are working. The point here is, I think, with the group employment, there's an opportunity to improve that retention score.
No, it's great. Yeah, it's Thanks.
Oh, yeah.
Hey Josh, thanks for the presentation. I love your unreasonable excitement.
Thank you, Chris.
Question around, so on farm we tend to hire people for jobs, not for careers.
Yeah.
And that feels like a problem, and then someone has to go and find their own pathway to find a career. Could this model work then for sort of regional farm groups or industries like, the cost of changing out to someone on minimum wage, Dairy NZ have got a calculator, it's something like $50,000 per person, so that's a big cost. To small
Look,
business.
thank you very much for that question. And as I say, expanding on what I took from Ian's phrase, substantive collaboration, this does require a greater good mindset shift that I'm not just employing this person for this job, I'm getting the person who I need right now in this workplace, but actually what we are collaboratively working on with this scheme is that across multiple employers, let's take a region, let's take Marlborough, let's take the viticulture and winemaking and harvesting and all of the things, that actually we would be potentially sharing workers around multiple employers. That's the bit that hasn't really happened before. Some of the cadetship schemes that I'm aware of have done a great job of exposing different people to different parts of an industry, but a multi-employer approach, that does take a cooperative. You know, the food and fibre sector certainly knows about cooperatives. This would be one about talent within a region. And I think that's that labour pool and utilisation piece where it gets kind of economically quite, it could be, I think, quite smart. Oh, this will be a hard one. Don't give him the mic. I'm tired.
It's a very easy one, Josh.
Okay.
You teased us with a little bit of sort of a hint that the UFS might support what you're describing, and I can imagine that sort of trying to sort of crash together what you're describing and the funding system's never going to be easy, but what do you see as being any potential highlights from the UFS changes and any gaps that still might be there?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, so several. One is a question of what is the pathway to work rate for and how long should it be, because it's the highest rate in the scheme. And yet I kind of think with vocational education, if you want to have a gap between the education and the employment, why? And why would you incentivise it to be as long as possible? So I wonder about the pathway to work thing, and that's something I think that we can work through with Te Pukenga as the training partner. I think the assessment and verification rate, sitting there on its own, has potential in this case too, because we've got people moving around employers and they're getting different parts of their program, and so actually a sort of a roving assessment model might play into that too. But last but certainly not least is that if we do a level 2 credential, UFS wouldn't apply, but youth guarantee certainly would, and that gets you back to the question of which age groups this is for. So that's why in terms of the pilot, TEC certainly seems very keen as a sort of it's certainly a legit use of the strategic component to try and innovate in this space. So that's the purse that would pay for this initial proof of concept. But absolutely our evaluation would have to go, well, how would you do this under the business as usual funds? And my answer to that would be, if it doesn't work, then why the hell not? It could be that you got the UFS wrong, not that this model's wrong.
Great, thank you. We've run out of time for questions, but Josh, you'll be here for the rest of the forum and tonight, so I'm sure you can have a chat to him then.